June 13th, 1944. Villers-Bocage, Normandy. 0523 hours. The sound came first, not the thunderous roar of engines or the crack of gunfire, but something quieter, more deliberate. The metallic click of a breech closing, the whisper of hydraulics adjusting elevation. Inside the cramped interior of Sherman tank Cobra King, Sergeant Michael Donovan pressed his eye against the periscope sight and watched dawn break over the Norman hedgerows in bands of amber and gray. His breath formed small clouds in the June morning chill. The air inside the tank carried the smell of cordite, sweat, and the peculiar metallic tang that came from spending 72 consecutive hours sealed inside 8 inches of welded steel. Around him, 4 men occupied their stations with the choreographed precision of factory workers on an assembly line. Loader, gunner, to driver, bow gunner, each moving in synchronization perfected through repetition until action became reflex. They had been stationary for 6 minutes, positioned hull down behind a collapsed stone wall that had once marked the boundary of a French farmer's wheat field. 6 minutes of stillness while German tanks prowled somewhere beyond the morning mist, their engines audible but invisible, hunting for the American force that had pushed too far, too fast into the spider's web of Norman villages. Donovan's hand rested on the turret traverse control. His fingers were numb. Not from cold, but from the vibration. 3 days of near-constant firing had reduced sensation to a distant memory. The Sherman carried 71 rounds of 75mm ammunition when fully loaded, and Cobra King had fired 63 of them since crossing into Villers-Bocage at dawn on June 11th. 63 shells expended in defense, in retreat, in the desperate mathematics of armored combat, where each shot either bought another minute of survival or announced your position to an enemy whose tanks mounted guns that could penetrate Sherman armor at ranges the Americans couldn't match. 8 shells remained. The light changed. Donovan saw movement through the mist, a shape too angular to be natural, too purposeful to be wreckage. He keyed the intercom, his voice steady despite the knowledge that what he was seeing meant they were about to die or kill, and the margin between those outcomes measured less than the time it took to speak 3 words. Panzer, on 2 o'clock. The turret swung right with the electric hum of motors straining against gear ratios. The gunner, Corporal James Fletcher, tracked the target through his sight, lips moving in silent calculation. Range, angle, relative velocity. His hand hovered over the firing trigger, but he didn't shoot. Not yet, because 8 shells had to last until either reinforcement arrived or darkness fell, and wasting ammunition on a shot that might miss, might deflect, might strike at an angle that only announced their presence without achieving penetration. That was how tank crews died. So they waited. 5 men breathing in synchronized rhythm inside a metal box, watching a German tank emerge from the mist like a prehistoric creature, its long 88mm gun barrels sweeping the landscape in slow arcs, and searching for threats it could kill from distances that made the Sherman's 75mm gun little more than a gesture of defiance. The wait lasted 17 seconds. 17 seconds during which Michael Donovan understood with absolute clarity that he was participating in an equation where numerical inferiority, technological disadvantage, and tactical desperation could only be balanced by one variable: the willingness to remain calm while everything screamed that survival meant flight. The Sherman wasn't invincible, it wasn't even particularly good. But it was what they had, and 8 shells, properly placed at ranges where courage compensated for technical limitation, might be enough. Fletcher fired. When the United States Army deployed the M4 Sherman tank to Europe in 1944, they did so with full knowledge of its deficiencies. Yet intelligence reports, combat assessments, and field tests had made clear that American medium tanks were outgunned by their German counterparts. A Panzer IV mounted a 75mm gun with higher muzzle velocity. A Panther carried a 75mm cannon that could penetrate Sherman frontal armor at distances exceeding 2,000 meters. The Tiger's 88mm gun transformed any engagement into a one-sided execution where German crews could fire from positions of complete safety while American tanks burned. The statistics were damning. In Normandy, the average operational life of a Sherman tank in frontline combat measured roughly 2 weeks. Crew survival rates varied by unit and engagement, but casualty figures told their own story. Tankers died at rates comparable to infantry, despite being encased in armor. The Sherman earned grim nicknames from the men who served in them. Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company's advertising slogan, "Lights first time, every time." When a Sherman was penetrated, the crew had seconds to evacuate before ammunition ignited, and the interior became an incinerator. American tankers knew this. They knew it before they shipped out, knew it during training, knew it every time they climbed through the hull hatch and sealed themselves inside. They understood that German tanks were superior in almost every measurable category: armor thickness, gun penetration, optical quality, and mechanical reliability. The industrial output that allowed America to produce 5 Shermans for every German Panther was tactical comfort for generals planning campaigns. But little consolation to crews who had to face those Panthers with equipment they knew was inferior. What they expected, perhaps, was that courage and numbers would compensate for technical disadvantage, that American industrial might would simply overwhelm through quantity, that superior logistics and air support would level the battlefield. What they discovered in the narrow lanes and dense hedgerows of Normandy was that war reduced to simpler mathematics. When a German tank appeared at 500 meters, doctrine and production statistics meant nothing. Only range, ammunition count, and the steadiness of a gunner's hand determined who burned and who went home. Cobra King's crew had already learned this lesson 3 times in as many days. They had learned it when Sergeant Davis's tank exploded 50 meters ahead of them, a victim to a Panther firing from a position they never saw. They had learned it when their own shots bounced off German armor at angles that should have penetrated, physics and metallurgy conspiring against them. They had learned it during the retreat from the town center, driving in reverse while German rounds sparked off their turret, each impact a reminder that survival was provisional and escape was measured in seconds. Now, with 8 shells remaining, and dawn revealing their position to an enemy that owned the tactical advantage, they were learning a final lesson: that inferior equipment, insufficient ammunition, and disadvantageous terrain could still yield survival if men refused to panic when panic was the logical response. Fletcher's first shot struck the Panzer IV's frontal glacis at a 30-degree angle and deflected into the ground, leaving a bright scar on German armor but achieving nothing beyond announcing Cobra King's position. The enemy tank pivoted immediately, gun traversing with mechanical precision toward the muzzle flash that had betrayed the Sherman's location. Donovan shouted for the driver to back up, but the transmission was already screaming, treads clawing at the Norman soil, the entire 30-ton vehicle lurching backward behind the stone wall, even as the German gun fired. The round passed through the space Cobra King had occupied 1 second earlier. It struck the farmhouse beyond them and detonated in a shower of stone and timber that rained down on the Sherman's hull like judgment. 7 shells remained, where they repositioned 40 meters west, using the hedgerow as concealment, and waited. The tactical situation was mathematically simple. German tanks carried more ammunition, more armor, and longer-range guns. American doctrine acknowledged this by emphasizing maneuver, flanking shots against side armor where Sherman guns could penetrate, multiple tanks coordinating to overwhelm single targets, and exploitation of terrain to minimize exposure time. But Cobra King was alone. The rest of their platoon had been destroyed or scattered during the previous day's engagement. Flanking required mobility. They were low on fuel. Coordination required allies. The radio had been damaged in yesterday's fighting, reduced to static and fragmentary transmissions that provided no tactical coordination. What remained was patience and geometry. The Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate Panzer IV side armor at ranges under 800 meters. Frontal shots were unreliable, except at near-suicidal distances. So they waited for the German commander to make a mistake, to expose his flank while maneuvering, to approach too close while searching, to present an angle that transformed technical inferiority into momentary advantage. The sun continued rising. Morning mist burned away, revealing the landscape in harsh detail. The German tank prowled through the ruins of Villers-Bocage like a predator confident in its superiority. It fired twice more at suspected positions, high-explosive rounds detonating against buildings and walls, searching for the American tank it knew was present but couldn't locate. Each shot Cobra King didn't return was a small victory. Ammunition conserved, and position concealed. Survival extended by minutes that accumulated into hours. At 0647, the Panzer IV advanced down a narrow lane between two collapsed buildings, its commander perhaps grown impatient with the hunt, perhaps believing the Americans had retreated. The tank's right side became visible for approximately 12 seconds as it passed through the gap. Fletcher fired without waiting for orders. The range was 300 meters, close enough that even the Sherman's inferior gun achieved penetration when striking at 90 degrees against side armor rated at 50 millimeters. The German tank didn't explode. There was no cinematic fireball, no dramatic secondary detonation. It simply stopped, smoke beginning to pour from its engine compartment, its turret slewing left in an aborted attempt at response before freezing. 30 seconds later, the crew began evacuating through hatches, 5 men stumbling away from their disabled vehicle, vanishing into the rubble. 6 shells remained. The engagement that historians would later catalogue as the defense of Villers-Bocage southeast sector lasted 9 hours and 14 minutes. During that time, Cobra King's crew encountered 7 German armored vehicles, 4 Panzer IVs, 2 Panthers, and 1 Jagdpanzer, 4 tank destroyer. They destroyed 3, disabled 2 others, and survived 2 encounters where survival was not the statistically probable outcome. They achieved this not through superior equipment or numerical advantage, but through the application of principles that couldn't be measured in armor thickness or gun calibration. The first principle was ammunition discipline. Every shot had to count, not merely as an expression of defiance, but as a mathematical contribution to survival. Fletcher developed a ritual: 3 breaths between target acquisition and firing, time used to verify range, calculate angle, and ensure the shot would hit where armor was weakest. In conventional combat, 3 breaths might mean death. Hesitation invited enemy fire. But with limited ammunition, every premature shot was a future death sentence. Better to die from enemy fire while preserving shells than to survive an engagement only to face the next one unarmed. The second principle was position discipline. Sherman tanks were inferior in open combat, but marginally less inferior when using terrain. Cobra King never remained stationary longer than 4 minutes. They fired, relocated, concealed, and waited. The hedgerows that made Normandy a nightmare for Allied advance became their advantage. Narrow lanes that forced German tanks into predictable paths, dense vegetation that obscured movement, and collapsed walls that provided hold-down positions. They traded speed for invisibility, accepting that limited mobility meant they couldn't retreat, but discovering that immobile defense, properly executed, was its own form of offense. The third principle was psychological. Donovan understood that his crew was terrified. How could they not be? Every German tank they encountered could kill them before they could effectively respond. Every engagement began from a position of disadvantage. Every shot they survived was probability-defying statistics. But terror, properly channeled, became focus. The loader's hands moved faster when fueled by fear. The driver's responses grew sharper when adrenaline converted thought into reflex. Fletcher's aim steadied when he accepted that missing meant dying, and dying was less acceptable than the tremor in his hands. By noon, 3 shells remained. Cobra King had withdrawn to a position behind a demolished church, its stones providing minimal concealment but some protection against anything except direct fire. Donovan rationed water from canteens that were nearly empty. None of the crew had slept in 78 hours. Their faces were black with cordite residue and smoke. The loader, Private Dennis Cooper, had a concussion from when his head struck the turret ring during a violent maneuver. The bow gunner, Private Martin Shaw, had second-degree burns on his hands from a fire they'd extinguished when an ammunition rack caught sparks. They were not heroes in the cinematic sense. They were 5 exhausted men whose survival had become a technical problem to be solved with dwindling resources. 3 shells. Perhaps 4 hours until darkness provided cover for escape. If they survived that long. If the Germans didn't bring up artillery, if their fuel lasted, if the statistical improbability that had preserved them this far continued to defy mathematics. At 13:27 hours, 2 Panthers appeared at the town's eastern edge, advancing in coordination, their tactics suggesting they were hunting a specific target rather than conducting general reconnaissance. Cobra King had been located, either through observation or report from other German units. The Panthers could engage from 1,500 meters with near certainty of penetration. Now, the Sherman's effective range was half that against Panther frontal armor, and even side shots required precision that exhaustion made increasingly unlikely. Donovan faced a calculus without comfortable solution. 3 shells against 2 Panthers. Flight was impossible. The engine would need 3 minutes to start cold, and they'd be disabled before moving 10 meters. Remaining concealed was temporary at best. Fighting meant expending ammunition against targets they probably couldn't kill, revealing their position and inviting destruction. He chose to wait, not from courage, but from absence of alternative. They sat in silence, 5 men listening to German engines growing closer, to the squeal of treads on a cobblestone, to the mechanical sounds of turrets traversing as the Panthers searched for targets. Fletcher tracked the nearest Panther through his sight, watching it approach, his hand resting on the firing trigger, waiting for an order that Donovan couldn't bring himself to give because firing meant dying, and not firing also meant dying, and there was no third option. The Panthers passed within 400 meters, never close enough to guarantee penetration, never far enough to provide safety. They searched for 23 minutes, their commanders perhaps questioning whether the American tank they'd been told to find actually existed or had withdrawn, or was merely a phantom reported by overeager observers. Eventually, they withdrew northward, and Cobra King remained frozen in position. 3 shells preserved, death postponed. So survival extended through no action of their own beyond the discipline of not firing when every instinct screamed to shoot. Darkness fell at 21:43 hours. By then, Cobra King had been stationary for 8 hours in the same position, the crew cycling through periods of alertness and micro-sleep, taking turns at watch while others collapsed into unconsciousness measured in minutes. They had heard German infantry moving through the ruins, heard vehicles passing on nearby roads, and heard the distant thunder of artillery preparation that meant someone, somewhere was dying in quantities that made their individual survival statistically meaningless. 3 shells remained, but they would never be fired. At 2200 hours, and Fletcher reported that the main gun's recoil mechanism had developed a hydraulic leak, a slow seepage that would eventually render the weapon inoperable. The loader discovered that the remaining 3 shells were all high-explosive rounds, effective against infantry and structures, but nearly useless against armored targets. Their 75mm armor-piercing ammunition had been exhausted hours ago, the last round expended against the second Panther they'd disabled by hitting its track rather than its armor. Mobility kill instead of destruction, survival through technicality rather than victory. The radio crackled at 2,247 hours. The first clear transmission in 2 days. A voice identified as Sabre 6 ordered all remaining armor in the sector to withdraw to Rally Point Baker, 3 kilometers southwest. The Cobra King acknowledged with a single word, Roger, that committed them to a 3-kilometer journey through contested terrain, in darkness, with degraded equipment and fuel reserves that might or might not last the distance. They departed at 23:15 hours, driving without lights, navigating by compass and memory, through a landscape transformed by combat into unrecognizable ruin. The journey took 94 minutes. They encountered no enemy forces, saw no German vehicles, experienced no drama beyond the slow prayer of hoping that fuel would last, that the transmission wouldn't fail, and that statistical probability which had sustained them this far would extend for another hour. Cobra King reached Allied lines at 0049 hours on June 14, 1944. They had survived 19 hours of combat with ammunition exhausted, equipment failing, and a crew on the edge of collapse. When Donovan finally climbed out of the turret hatch and stood on solid ground, his legs buckled. Not from injury, but from the simple fact that standing required muscle memory his body had temporarily forgotten. An officer approached with a clipboard and questions: unit designation, ammunition status, casualty report, fuel levels. Donovan answered mechanically, his mind still calculating angles and ranges for targets that no longer existed. Behind him, Fletcher and Cooper were helping Shaw out of the bow gunner position, his burned hands making the climb difficult. The loader was vomiting behind the tank, his concussion finally catching up with adrenaline's recession. They had killed 3 German tanks, disabled 2 others, and survived encounters with 7 armored vehicles that outclassed them in every specification. They had done this with 71 shells that became 63, that became 8, that became 3, that were never fired. They had done this not because the Sherman was an adequate tank. It wasn't, but because men in insufficient equipment had refused to accept insufficiency as an excuse for failure. The symbolic weight of those final 3 unfired shells resonated beyond Cobra King's individual survival. Throughout Normandy, American tank crews faced identical calculations: inferior equipment, superior enemy, and survival dependent on discipline rather than advantage. The abundance that characterized American industrial production meant that destroyed Shermans were replaced within days, that crews were reconstituted, and that the numerical advantage eventually overwhelmed German technical superiority. But abundance in logistics didn't translate to abundance in combat. Each engagement reduced to scarcity: scarce ammunition, scarce cover, scarce time, and scarce luck. The 3 shells became Donovan's talisman. He kept them in Cobra King throughout the remainder of the campaign, refusing to expend them even when fresh ammunition arrived. The loader thought it was superstition. Fletcher thought it was battlefield neurosis. But Donovan understood it as something different. A reminder that survival didn't correlate with superiority, that victory wasn't guaranteed by quality, and that the margin between life and death measured smaller than the brass casings of 3 unfired rounds. The Sherman tank earned its reputation through accumulation, and no single engagement proved its adequacy. No single battle demonstrated its superiority. But across thousands of engagements, tens of thousands of crew members, and hundreds of thousands of rounds fired, the numerical advantage ground down German armor through mathematics too large to resist. For every Cobra King that survived through discipline and luck, 5 other Shermans burned. But the 5 were replaced. The crews were replaced. The ammunition was replaced. And eventually, inevitably, the weight of American production buried German technical advantage under sheer volume. But that strategic reality provided little comfort to men like Donovan, who understood that their individual survival was a statistical outlier rather than proof of system effectiveness. And the 3 unfired shells represented something more honest than propaganda about American invincibility or democratic superiority. They represented the truth that men in inadequate equipment could survive through a refusal to accept inadequacy as determinative. That 8 shells, carefully rationed, provided more combat power than 71 shells fired carelessly. That survival sometimes meant not firing even when every instinct demanded action. Michael Donovan survived the war. Cobra King did not. The tank was destroyed 3 weeks later during the breakout from Normandy, hit by German anti-tank fire while Donovan was on leave. The replacement crew evacuated successfully. None were seriously injured. The 3 shells Donovan had preserved remained in the ammunition rack when the tank burned, detonating in the fire along with everything else. He learned of Cobra King's destruction through official notification, the same bureaucratic language that informed families of deaths applied to equipment losses. He felt something he couldn't articulate. Not grief exactly, but recognition that survival had always been provisional, that those 9 hours in Villers-Bocage had been the exception rather than the rule, that eventually probability reasserted itself and statistical likelihood overtook improbable survival. After the war, Donovan rarely discussed his service. When asked about tank combat, he defaulted to anecdotes that emphasized humor over horror, camaraderie over calculation. But late in his life, during an interview for a military history project, he was asked what moment from the war remained most vivid. And he didn't mention the tanks they'd destroyed, or the decorations his crew received. Instead, he described the moment at dawn when 8 shells remained, when Fletcher had his eye pressed to the gun sight, when the decision to fire or wait determined whether 5 men lived or died. "We couldn't match them," Donovan said, his voice quiet and factual. "Their tanks were better, their guns were better, their training was probably better too, but we had 8 shells, and we made each one count more than their 80. That's not heroism, that's just math. And math doesn't care about fairness." The interviewer asked what happened to the 3 shells that remained unfired. Donovan was silent for a long moment before responding. "They burned," he said. "Same as everything else. 3 shells. 3 pieces of brass and steel and explosive that represented the difference between calculation and desperation, between survival and annihilation, between accepting inadequacy and exploiting the narrow margins where inadequate equipment became sufficient through refusal to accept limitation. They were never fired, never tested whether they would have penetrated armor or saved lives or bought another hour of survival. They simply existed as potential, as the promise that ammunition remained, that response was possible, that empty wasn't yet imminent. In this, they symbolized something larger than individual combat. American abundance in World War II wasn't abundance of quality, but abundance of quantity. Not better tanks, but more tanks. Not superior crews, but more crews. Not technological advantage, but industrial capacity that replaced losses faster than they accumulated. The 3 unfired shells represented the inverse, the moment when abundance didn't matter, when what mattered was making insufficient resources sufficient through discipline rather than supply. Cobra King's crew survived not because democracy provided superior equipment. It didn't. They survived because free men, properly trained and trusted to make tactical decisions without rigid doctrine, adapted to circumstance in ways that conscripted soldiers following inflexible orders couldn't match. The Germans had better tanks, but American crews had the freedom to withdraw, to conserve, to refuse engagement, to survive rather than die heroically. That flexibility, that trust in individual judgment over systematic doctrine, was the true American advantage. Not the Sherman's armor, but the commander's autonomy to decide when 8 shells were enough and when 3 shells were worth preserving. The Germans couldn't touch that tank crew, not because they lacked opportunity, but because Cobra King's crew refused to present opportunity. They fought when angles favored survival. They withdrew when probability favored death. They preserved ammunition when future threats outweighed present targets. They made 8 shells count more than German dozens, because they had the freedom to choose when counting mattered. And when dawn finally broke on June 14th, and Cobra King reached Allied lines with 3 shells unfired and 5 men alive, the real victory wasn't survival. Survival was merely the outcome. The victory was that 5 men in inadequate equipment had faced superior forces and refused to accept that superiority determined fate. That calculation could overcome disadvantage. That math didn't care about fairness, but neither did discipline, patience, or the stubborn refusal to panic when panic was rational. 3 shells remained at dawn, 3 pieces of potential energy that were never released. 3 symbols of the difference between abundance and adequacy, between having everything and making enough be sufficient. They burned eventually, same as everything else. But for 9 hours on June 13th, 1944, they represented the most important quantity in war, not firepower or armor or range, but the promise that one more shot remained, that empty hadn't arrived, and that survival extended for another minute into a future where minutes accumulated into hours, into dawn, into home. The Germans couldn't touch them until they ran out of shells at dawn, and by then, dawn was enough.